You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 15. Edward and Helen. During the next week, Mark and Jane made preparations for the journey. They had booked a hotel in Manhattan, and the next day David drove them to Heathrow. The flight went smoothly and uneventfully, and a cab took them to their hotel from the John F. Kennedy International Airport. Jane made a quick call back to Hampstead to confirm their safe arrival, and then they both set about the business of deciding how best to tackle the problem of locating the girl in David's photographs, if indeed, by a stroke of luck, she was the agent employed to help the luckless Nathan Fraser. It occurred to them that being in the medical profession as they were, as doctor and nurse, from a well-known Addenbrooke teaching hospital in the city of Cambridge, England, it may just work in their favor as a way of finding the particular hospital where the woman victim was being treated. The difficulty was knowing where to ask, and for what reason. They had with them all the relevant papers, names, and phone numbers they might require, including the name and address of a fellow medical student Mark had befriended at Cambridge. This doctor was now an influential name in the field of bone disease and related blood disorders. He could well be their key into the U.S. hospital system. The pace of living in New York appalled them, everyone racing around as if there was no tomorrow. Dominating skyscraper buildings amidst streets of seething thousands, and a place where car horns wore out before the clutches. From the down-and-outs to the up-and-offs, every color, race, and creed, milling and swirling about in a human slurry. They decided it would be best to try to contact Mark's old acquaintance, Dr. Edward Rayner. Years ago, when he was over in England attending a conference in Edinburgh, he had called Mark on the phone when he was working at one of the London hospitals. He had told Mark that he'd do his best to get down there to see him if the conference wasn't too long-winded, but if not, for him to look him up if Mark was ever over in the States. Unfortunately, the conference took up all of Edward's time as one thing led to another, and he had written to him on his return to apologize. A call to his last known address in Trenton revealed that he had just started a small specialist hospital unit just south of Lakewood, New Jersey, about 50 miles south of New York City. Mark eventually contacted him and was invited to visit, so arranged a hire car for the trip down from New York. Out of the Big Apple, it was more of a holiday atmosphere for them, in sharp contrast to a mission to maintain world peace. Their journey took them through a beautiful wooded region and on past Lakewood. Mark stopped the car to consult the directions given to him over the phone, and it wasn't long before they turned the corner, which brought the hospital area into view. Edward had built his house at the edge of the grounds with a driveway lined with all kinds of trees and shrubs. They pulled up outside the main entrance, and a few minutes later, Edward came down the shallow, wide steps to greet them. "Mark, how wonderful to see you again," he enthused, shaking his hand. "And Jane, isn't it?" She nodded. "Do come in." He led the way up the steps and into a spacious hallway, bedecked with exotic trailing plants and colorful creepers. "You must love plants," Jane commented, rather stating the obvious. "Oh, yes, yeah, I do, passionately. It's my hobby. I love to have them surround me." They continued on into the living area. The ceiling was all glass, pouring sunlight onto yet more luscious verdant foliage. "I'll fetch my wife. Do sit down. I won't be a moment." Edward disappeared into the tiled passageway toward the kitchen and returned a minute or so later, leading his wife by the hand. "Do meet Helen, my wife. In fact, it seems very strange for me to say my wife, as we only married 5 weeks ago tomorrow." "Well, many congratulations to you both," said Mark, unable to take his eyes off an utterly stunning Helen. Her long blonde hair cascaded down her cheesecloth shirt and reached down to delectable bottom poured into faded Levi's. She was barefoot and as natural and refreshing as the exotic flora around her. "Hello," she said, as they both went over to one of the many identical dark blue couches exquisitely positioned amongst the greenery, the tallest plants reaching the glass roof 20 feet above their head and angled towards the afternoon sun. "Hi," answered Mark, the tone of the greeting being entirely unfamiliar to Jane. His interest in Helen had not escaped her. Edward was not at all as Mark had remembered him. He wore an immaculate gray suit with an open-necked beige shirt and pale gray suede shoes. He wore his blonde hair on the long side with curls overlapping his collar and spoke with kind of a Swedish accent. He leaned forward on the couch to speak. "Mark, where have you both been staying?" his expression changing to concern. "Oh, we flew into New York and stayed at a hotel overlooking Central Park," explained Mark. "We've come over here to try and see a patient who's in a hospital somewhere. The problem is that we don't know her name or what hospital she's at." "This much seems strange," he added apologetically. "As I explained in my call, all we've got to go on is a newspaper report and some photos." "Well, it does a little, but I'm sure there's a very good reason for finding out," said Edward understandingly. "There sure is," Mark confirmed. "I would dearly love to discuss the whole complicated affair with you." Mark hesitated, rather embarrassed. "But at the moment, if it were possible for you to pull some strings, as it were, I would be eternally grateful." "Ha! Eternity is a very long time, Mark. Don't you worry, I'll pull some strings for you as a personal favor. I want you both to thoroughly enjoy yourselves while you're over here. I'll find out what you want to know, no questions asked, okay?" He smiled reassuringly at both of them. "Well, thank you," replied Mark. "It is very important." "I'm sure it is, Mark. Now, have you both eaten?" They had to admit that the journey had whipped up a rather unexpected appetite, even though they had thought they'd packed enough snacks. "How about a salad? Or perhaps you would prefer something hot?" He exchanged glances with both of them in anticipation of a reply. Mark looked to Jane to choose. "A salad would be lovely," said Jane. Mark nodded and turned to smile to Helen. She held Mark's attention with her eyes as she returned the smile. Edward and Helen went along the plant-lined passageway which led to the kitchen. Edward called back, "Mark, do you ever look at the papers on my desk? It's what I've been up to these last few years." "Right, I will," replied Mark, glancing around the spacious greenhouse for a desk. He walked over to the far corner where Edward had his work set out on a huge desk. The massive window facing him had commanded a stunning view of a shallow valley, which swept away and down into meadowland flanking a large lake, a dream vista if there ever was one. Mark heard Helen return and started a chat with Jane. He looked at the papers and various notes strewn across the desk. They were mainly academic papers which had been published over the last few years or so, concerning an area of medicine involving methods of detecting and treating bone marrow disorders, and disease with emphasis on types of arthritis and aging effects on bone, right through to hematological conditions arising from diseased bone marrow causing leukemia. An absolute mass of work which reflected Edward's dedication to achieve the final eradication of these conditions. Mark spent some time reading his work, while in the background he was aware of the two women chatting. A call from the direction of the kitchen tore away his concentration. "Grub up," called Edward, something Mark hadn't heard since his college days. He went over to where Helen and Jane were sitting, and they all set off along the passageway, the aroma of fresh vegetables assailing their nostrils. "Smells great," complimented Mark. "I didn't know you were into things culinary." "Come on," came the reply, as they entered the dining area adjacent to the lounge. "It's only a washing and chopping exercise. I'm not cooking." Nevertheless, Edward had prepared a wonderful aesthetic selection of vegetables, including radishes impaled on cocktail sticks stuck into half an upturned grapefruit. They all chatted away whilst they ate, and later returned to the living room. Mark and Jane were invited to stay the night, indeed for as long as they wished. During the evening, Edward excused himself to make some telephone calls in the quiet of his study at the far end of the house. He'd previously told Mark of his many friends and contacts he'd made in a great many hospitals and clinics, especially in New York State and the surrounding area. He frequently traveled to California for conferences and conventions and delivered lectures to medical students. He also provided refresher courses for general practitioners, as well as hospital doctors and surgeons. He'd once given a talk at Addenbrooke's and was promptly asked back to give another if he was ever back in England. Mark and Jane spent some time speaking with Helen, trying to explain what it was like in England. She hoped to accompany Edward the next time he visited over there. Good hour later, Edward joined them. "I've spoken to some of my colleagues in New York and discovered some of them know the hospital where the young lady is being treated, and I was given that information in strictest confidence. What I did was to contact the hospital concerned and explain that two of my associates were making a statistical analysis of the type and location of gunshot wounds affecting victims shot in New York City. As you're probably aware, Mark, the frequency of shootings in the city is quite high, so it is quite plausible for this type of statistical analysis to be undertaken in view of this. I thought it was quite a good idea, don't you?" he said, looking at Mark and then Jane. "Of course, I must have complete trust in you both to concoct some sort of statistics-gathering system, one which would stand up to scrutiny if your work was to be examined. You understand, I hope, that what I've done is to lie, and in my professional context that has breached medical ethics. If this were to be discovered, I'd probably be in trouble. You both must think it odd that I've done this, but I'm convinced that you have a crucial need to see or speak with this woman, and that's good enough for me. But for God's sakes, make a convincing job of those statistics." Mark was stunned at the generosity of his friend. "I don't think we could accept an arrangement which put your career in jeopardy. It's just too much. We can't let you do that." "It's too late. It's done. Consider it a favor," he said almost casually. "I'll hear no more about it. Okay, Mark?" Mark looked at Jane and then over to Helen. Neither seemed to object to the plan in the slightest, even though it would be difficult preparing convincing paperwork in such a relative short time. Edward stood behind Helen, seated on the couch next to Jane. Mark stared at the floor, deep in thought, suddenly looking up to speak to Edward. "When this matter is cleared up, I'll tell you all about it. It's rather complicated." Edward went over to the wine cabinet and asked who would like a drink to toast to the success of the venture. As the evening progressed, both hosts and guests, in a pleasant frame of mind, exchanged stories and jokes until the early hours. Mark showed a special interest in Helen, as did Edward for Jane. The two women went out of the room to prepare coffee before retiring for the night. Helen spoke first, much to Jane's relief. "It's all right with you, is it, Jane?" What's that?" Jane replied, hesitantly, half guessing what Helen meant. "Borrowing Mark for the rest of the night. What do you think of Edward?" she asked nonchalantly, setting out the cups. "Well, captivating, I think is the word," answered Jane, amazed at Helen's coolness. "No, I mean, do you find him sexy? I think Mark's wonderful, and I love that full beard. You don't mind, do you?" Helen had put her own feelings into perspective, hoping Mark thought the same about her. Without answering either of Helen's two quick-fire questions, Jane looked up. "Hadn't we better discuss this with the men? I mean, I don't know what to say. You needn't worry about them. They've already committed themselves, I can assure you. If Mark had been jealous of Edward's attention to you, don't you think he would have said something by now?" Helen poured out the coffees and looked to Jane for confirmation. Yes, well, I suppose you're right. It's just that this situation has never arisen before. Well, it has now, so enjoy it. That is, if it's okay with you and Mark. Edward and I certainly wouldn't want to cause any ill feeling between us all. Just the opposite, in fact. She smiled sweetly at Jane to reassure her. Anyway, when the men went out for some fresh air, I'm sure they were discussing us, if I know Edward. When the two women returned with the coffees, they were met with a raucous laughter coming from the direction of the open patio windows. The men were swapping bawdy jokes. "Coffee?" called Helen, as Mark wandered in closely, followed by Edward. "There you are," she said to Jane. "There's only one thing on their minds." Mark exchanged reassuring smiles with Jane as they sipped their coffee. Not much more was said, or indeed needed to be said. The cups were deposited in the kitchen, and Edward flicked out the lights and took hold of Jane's hand as he placed the other on Mark's shoulder and winked.